carriage carry a man past a checkpoint while men look at the wrong column. When Bastien arrives at the back door, he is winded with news that is both hopeful and dangerous. There is a clerk who is late with rolls, he says, and the words are like a match struck in a dark room. And there's talk that Jean Morel has been seen propping open a door for a woman who had a baby in her arms. He speaks fast, as a man whose limbs do not trust his lips. I fold my hands and do not let my heart leap as high as it wants to. Time has not taught me to expect mercy without cost. Still, there is a shape of possibility in Bastien's breath. The world bends for a moment on a hinge of someone else's mistake. We prepare for what we must prepare for: the quick exit, the hidden book, the false ledger to be laid out when the agents arrive. In the places where we seal seams. I place false bindings on shelves where the agents might look first, and tuck our marginalia in the well-worn copies that a clerk might be tempted to open because of mildew or scent. We rehearse plausible faces: the wide-eyed merchant who has only come to buy a ledger for his accounts, the stooped woman who has come for a prayer book for a sick child. Acting the ordinary becomes our defense. Yet there is a price. I feel like a weight in my chest. We do not simply defy the tribunal. We alter the texture of our own lives. The shop is no longer merely a refuge for books. It is a theater of evasion. The books themselves are actors, their spines wearing masks, their margins holding wedges of revolt. I find myself thinking of marginalia as seeds offered to a soil of civic possibility. If enough seed is sown, then perhaps a field will grow where names are not only assigned by an administrative mind but claimed back by those who bear them. The night closes as it always does when the city is on the cusp of a new pressure, with the sound of a distant bell and a cart that creaks like a throat. I lock the door and stand for a long time with my hand on the latch. The ledger presses like snow. I have counted the leaks and sealed the seams I could find. I have accepted the small mercies of men like Jean Morel and paid the price when it must be paid. We have bought time with misfiled papers and burned plates. We have, for the moment, held the machine's teeth at bay, but the tension is real and cumulative. A commissaire like Renaud does not look at a single misfile and sleep after it. He notices patterns. He sees the shop window twice and then once more. He learns to watch a neighbor and to ask why she reads spines of a certain hue. The net tightens when men like him become practiced at reading not only officials but ordinary gestures. What we have gained by misplacing a name may buy a life or two, but it will not unmake the ledger. And so I finish the evening's work with hands that tremble only a little, and a ledger beneath my pillow as if to prove to myself that some part of me still aims to count. Dawn will bring new tasks, false ledgers to press, new marginalia to plan, rotes to alter. We have a reprieve, and the small mercies of Jean Morel are as fragile as the wing of a bird. I know those wings can be plucked. Outside, the street is a ledger of lights, windows like eyes, some closed, some half open. The city seems to breathe, an organism of modest habits and monstrous administrations. When I close the shutters and light a single candle, its flame seems disproportionately brave. I arrange the night's papers and set aside a plan for the square, because a map must be thought of before one moves towards a public gambit. The idea is simple: to make the ledger's command less absolute. To put alternative names into circulation so that the habit of reading lists will no longer bind people as it has. It is an obscene and delicate calculation, an arithmetic of refusal. I go to bed with the shop's smell of glue and paper about me, and the knowledge of the city's pressure presses like a palm on my chest. Jean Morel's mercies have bought us a little time. Madame Rousseau's eyes have warned us that we must move faster. The machine tightens, but our small acts have teeth of their own. When I sleep, I think of margins and seams, of the tiny places where a book will allow a name to slip, and of the steps we will have to take at dawn. The next day will demand of us a re-ask: can a city's conscience be loosened by a ledger misfiled? I do not know. But the next move is not mine alone. It will be made in the square, with a crowd that has yet to decide whether to believe the writing on a page or the motion of its own hands. Outside, a cart creaks and a bell tolls in the distance. The network tightens like a fist, but a fist can be pried open. For now, we patch the small seams and practice breathing. Tomorrow, if the city is still ours for the asking, we will see whether a crowd will learn the arithmetic of choice or merely the habit of reading lists. The ledger watches, we watch back. By the time light had the decency to take hold in the alleys, Tyner's cellar was a furnace of purpose. We had always known that the ledger's power lay not in ink or paper alone, but in the behavior of people who treated a name as a sentence. So if they could make the city obey a list, we would press other lists into the same shape and see which habit held. Tyne worked as if the press itself were a confessor. The lead blocks clunked, the platen sighed, and the smell of iron and damp type filled the narrow room where we pressed our counter-narrative into pulp and fiber. He had lost sleep to this. Lines of metal had to be filed until they lay truthful enough to be believed. Guides needed to be adjusted, so the words looked as if some clerk had hurried them with official distaste. The paper had to be thin, aged with tea, and the few sun rings we could fake. It was artistry in reverse crafting falsehoods so that they might open a different kind of truth. I folded the sheets, each crease measured like a litany. Lucy returned like a bird you do not entirely trust moved beside me. Her hands seemed too eager for the calm of that place. She wanted the press to be more of a pulpit and less of a workshop. Bastien came and went, a small man who could make a leaflet look like a coin thrown into a crowd, ordinary, exchangeable, quickly forgotten. He laughed at jokes that were not there and sold the appearance of normality with the energy of a child hawking roasted chestnuts. Madeleine was not in the cellar. I had asked her to take the air and move among those who would gather, for salons teach one the precise angles from which people will accept or reject a whisper. Father Binot had counseled temperance. He had always believed that the conscience must be bent with care, or at least he had counseled that the priest could not become another clumsy conspirator. Jean Morel, in his quiet way, had agreed to let certain pages vanish from municipal hands for a little while. The city was a web. We tugged a thread and watched how the spiders reacted. We had copied lists that named the next condemned, and had altered a few with a surgeon's patience, changing dates by a day, changing an order, inserting a baker where a scholar's name had been, or the reverse. The success of our counter lists in the past had been measured not only by who escaped, but by the succeeding confusion that made officials doubt the sacredness of their registers. Now we went larger. The square has always been the place a city shows itself. It is where names are said aloud, and where the people hear how they are to be called. That is why I chose it. Noon found me at the square's edge, standing where the sun could not quite judge my face, and the tribunal's shadow still stretched across the stones like the underlayer of a proof. The market had its rhythms, the hawkers and the children, and the mothers who burned cabbage over braziers, so the smell of boiled greens would cover the smell of other things. It was a place where the ordinary kept violent things at bay until you began to change what ordinary meant. Bastien moved like a current. He did not shout elevation or give himself away with the kind of rhetoric that expects applause. He used the small voice that slips along an ear, list for the day, names set by the tribune, come and read. People took because they always take. They took lists, they took pamphlets, they tucked them into skirts and pockets. He came to me once, his breath a little ragged. They're fairing them, mademoiselle. They think them official. That was the point. To be effective, our prints had to look as if they belonged to a world that had always been right about its lists. We could not be conspirators who pitched manifestos into the square shouting falsehood that only hardens belief. We were whisperers, and the whisper had to sound like gossip, the most trusted religion among streets. Madeleine moved her hands with the ease of someone who could make a rumor look like lace 1 minute and a dagger the next. She brushed a sleeve, caught an ear, and in the space of that gesture, a widow who had come to sell thread found herself folding a sheet and then looking at it as if for the first time. The list looked real. The funeral director looked at a name. A child clutched at a paper, and a man who had been certain he would be safe laughed short, and then no longer. The square brews sensation faster than one can measure. It thickens into something you either ride or are drowned by. I walked among them, offering nothing overly revolutionary. I spoke like a bookkeeper at prayer, precise and dry. Check your list, madame. There are a few misprints. If a name appears twice, treat the later date as eased. People listened because the voice of calm in those days is a currency. I had learned to speak in the measured bar of accountancy, for it disarmed suspicion. A woman pinched my sleeve and asked, voice small, is it true? Is my son's name? She did not finish. I had known mothers like her once by the street and now again by the square. I could have lied entirely, could have told her the list was a forgery intended only to free his life. Instead, I showed her a margin note, my own scrawl in small, cramped letters. Names may be amended, ask again. It is a strange thing to put doubt into someone's hands. Sometimes it becomes a stone they throw. Sometimes it becomes a seed. Opposite the tribunal steps, Commissaire Renaud let his presence be a kind of firm punctuation. It was not possible for him to be entirely absent. Every man of his sort carries the burden of authority like a book on his chest. He did not shout. He did not need to. He stood, a ledger in his glove, and watched people untuck their lists and discuss them with the same solemnity one uses when comparing wills. His gaze found me as if the city's habit of naming could reach through the press and detect the flinch of my fingers. For a moment I felt the odd intimacy of two people who work with records, he to produce them as law, I to move them as possibility. He could have had me arrested by the hand. He could have set his men to search my shop then and there. Instead, he watched me for a long while. There was that strange thing people who have been trained to count do, the desire to tidy a ledger. His jaw worked, and perhaps he was making a mental correction. Lucy moved through the crowd like a ripple. She had been gone but not absent. Our desperate plan to release her had not been without cost. She bore the dark ring of recent fear under her eyes, and the quiet steadiness of someone who has seen the tribunal cellars. She placed leaflets in the hands of girls whose hands smelt of laundry starch. She laughed and threw a paper to a soldier who frowned and then frowned less. At one point she caught the sleeve of a revolutionary youth she had once loved, and they exchanged a look that was both tenderness and reproof. That is the weight of youth. It asks the world to be immediate and unfurls like a banner in a storm. As the sheet spread, the square changed its pitch. Men who had been certain of the ledger's finality began to lift brows, comparing names, looking at dates. I had placed in margins notes, small notes that suggested the list might be amended, that clerks sometimes transposed names, that those who record are not gods but scribes with tired hands. We had printed small questions in the margins: who wrote this, whose hand benefits, so that the act of reading became itself suspect. At the center of things, a cluster of laborers tore a page into two. I watched the movement as if it were a bell. The torn list might have been a sign of defiance, a rejection born of anger. Or it might simply have been a way to start a scrap of fuel for the cooking fire. Either way, it became meaningful. The tribunal depends upon the illusion of people believing the ledger. If enough people begin to treat the ledger as a fallible thing, the apparatus that executes names begins to falter. That is the arithmetic. People are the true type. Their belief sets the case. Renaud moved then, but not as a man who would force a crowd. He approached with a policeman's politeness that disguises the weight of a tablet. Mademoiselle le Maire, he said, as if to a neighbor who had committed a small infraction. This is most irregular. He had always had a way of making indictments sound like etiquette. You know the square, mademoiselle. Names should be fixed. Uncertainty breeds terror. I meet him with my ledgered voice and a calm I had had to bind around me like a jacket. Commissaire, I said, uncertainty is a dangerous honesty. The city needs it now. He did not smile. He heard the word needs, and I saw the muscles around his mouth clench. To a man who wants certainty, the proposition that a city might choose its own names is like offering him a blade, not yet dull enough to trust. There was shouting then, not the orchestrated cry of revolution, but the ragged noise of people who are learning how to disagree. Some wanted names to be firm, they wanted to hold a sentence as one holds bread, solid and edible. Others, the ones who had begun to fold our margins into their private prayers, tore the lists and argued that to be named by the tribunal was not a destiny but an act of violence. In the swirl of sound, Lucy found me and said nothing. She handed me a scrap where a man had written with a coal, "I am not a number." The words, raw and crude, pleased me with their blunt truth. Made more official by my presence in the square, this crowd's small acts began to resemble something larger, a city refusing to be enumerated by a hand it could not see. We had imagined that this day would bring arrests, that Renaud would strike, that someone would be taken to the tribunal with a paper still clenched between fingers. We had also hoped that it would break the pattern. Both hopes were realistic. The crowd's mood swung like a pendulum. Some faces grew hard with fear and then, as if catching a wind, softened into a new suspicion. Rumor and rereading work like a disease and an inoculation at once. By afternoon, Renaud's agents moved in, not like wolves, but like clerks who have been told to tidy a mess. Jean Morel found me near the fountain and, in a pocketed gesture, slid me a municipal note that said certain detentions would be delayed. For now, he said simply, and in those 2 words was the measure of his bravery. He was not a man of grand gestures. He understood the small economy of these days. A delay can mean a life. A day can mean the difference between a rope and a safe house. As the light thinned and shadows lengthened, the square's energy did not die. People argued. Some prayed aloud. Some kissed and hid paper in bodices. It is a strange economy when the smallest piece of pulp can be worth a life. The gambit had worked in what mattered most. The ledger's supposed inevitability had been ruptured. Men and women in that square for the first time in months entertained the possibility that their names need not be uttered by a clerk who updates rows in neat calligraphy. They could be named by friends, by spouses, by themselves. Yet I knew we had not won. The cost was always the other half of the coin. By inviting people to doubt, we had also invited those who prefer certainty to sharpen their tools. The tribunal does not relinquish power because it is disproved. It clamps down because it fears contamination. The day had entered the city's memory, but the memory had not yet hardened into law. That night, as we gathered in the cramped back room, Tien poured a drink and did not smile. "We have taken the first step," he said, "but it is a step on a slope." Lucy, exhausted, folded a paper as if teaching her hands to be gentle. It felt like a prayer, she said, and in her exhaustion there was no triumph, only a recognition of what had been risked and spent. We would have to work harder. We would have to refine the press forgeries, craft better marginalia, and encourage other small acts of naming, bread sellers who announce people's trades, washers who write notations on collars, singers who adopt new refrains. The square had been a start. The city would need gutters and laundries, kitchens and front rooms. This is how resistance grows, not only in the grand gestures, but in the repetition of new habits until the old ledger looks anomalous. And yet, I lay awake that night with the ledger's name folded in my chest like a coin I did not know I had lost. The shadow of Renaud's ledgered face reminded me that our noise had been heard, and that he would answer with his kind of arithmetic. We had loosened a thing that binds. He would attempt to tighten it. That is the shape of every contest. When you pull one rope, another crew begins to haul at the other end. I did not know who would be taken next. I only knew this: the square had been a place of reckoning, and that the act of giving names back to those who bear them had been begun. I had not cast the ledger into the fire. I had shown that its pages could be read otherwise. That is a small victory. It is also a provocation. Outside my shop the night was thin. A woman rehearsed the whispered questions we had printed. A child practiced tearing paper thoughtfully under the light of a gutter lamp. Our acts had sown a kind of habitude to doubt, to ask, to rewrite. For all the fear, the square had provided a tool, not the false comfort of a promise to save everyone, but the more dangerous gift of a choice. I slept with my ledger beneath my pillow and woke with it still there, the name that had once meant a fate, now a possibility for contestation. The blade still hung. The city remained perilous, but names, for the first time in a long while, were contested. That evening ended with the soft knowledge that we had given people a small, terrible question to carry home: who will name me? And I, who had sold books beneath the guillotine, waited to see whether they would answer it themselves or wait for a clerk to answer for them. When the morning came, the square would be different, and so would we. The ledger's monopoly had been interrupted. It would regroup. Renaud would marshal his men and his ledgers. We would have to respond. But for a breath in the middle of the day, under the eye of a sky that had seen many matters of state, the city had looked at itself and decided that names are not always sentences carved before birth. It is a dangerous thought, and dangerous thoughts are the sort that make people act. That was our small and terrible triumph, enough to keep us awake, and enough perhaps to keep us alive, if luck and cunning held together like stitched pages. Dawn arrives like a thin apology, the kind you offer when you have nothing substantial to give. The morning is a pale cloth slit with chimney smoke, and the sound of cartwheels on wet cobbles. Inside, the shop keeps its usual smells: glue, old paper, the ghost note of lemon oil on shelf wood. I have slept poorly and with one eye open, because sleep in those hours is an indulgence and a risk. There are things that need to be tidied only so that they may be left in a state that will not betray us. They arrive as if by appointment, though I think there is no more finesse in municipal violence than brute timing. A rap solid, professional at the door, and then the click of boots. I keep my fingers on a ledger while I walk to the door, as if by holding a book I can lay claim to a different law. The street outside is colder than the room where I count the hours by the slant of light on the dust. I open and let them in. Boots, uniforms, the faint smell of boiled leather and ink. A clerk with a ledger in his arms, the quill in his hand a little like an accusing finger. They spread as one expects them to spread, like damp on linen. An officer, 2 municipal agents, a clerk who will read names with the tonic of bureaucracy. They are practiced at the business of looking anxious, of making owners spill what they hide beneath their hearts. Commissaire Renaud himself is not among them, but his absence is a presence, like a shadow with a ledger-shaped mouth. I have prepared for this on the paltry calendar of our resistance, shelves dusted, false bottoms sealed with camphor, the smaller ledgers bound in wrappers of plain paper. The annotated bindings I have placed in unsuspecting volumes. Tiny's forged plates are stored in a chimney opposite his shop. Lucy's leaflets are in Bastien's satchel, ready to be loosened into a crowd. Father Benoît has promised sanctuary to those we cannot hide. The plan is not a plan so much as a choreography of survival in which each small movement must appear accidental. They begin at the counter with a civility that has been practiced 1,000 times in municipal rooms. We act upon a report, the clerk says. His voice is smooth the way one reads an invoice. The agents take to the shelves with curious efficiency, pulling out books and flipping through as if they were searching for receipts. One of them hums a chanson under his breath. Instruments of the state hum habits, too. Madame Rousseau is already at the window. She has been drawn by municipal precision like a woman to a soap opera. Her eyes shine. I stand behind the counter with my hands folded, not so much in submission as in the pose one takes while performing a domestic ritual. To move hastily is to draw an eye, to stand still is to invite a complacency that might let you move in ways unseen. They do not notice the small things, the way I carry the heel of my hand over a title to flatten the impression of some marginal note, the way I slide a folded page into the shoulder of a book as if persuading it to sleep. Any contraband in the premises? The officer asks. It is a rehearsal line. I tell the truth in small shavings. There are some pamphlets, mostly harmless. I name a poet I once sold who has since become suspect. Names are the currency to trade in when you mean to stay alive. They inspect invoices, check the binding papers, laugh at a pun. One of the clerks, younger than the rest, finds a receipt and pronounces it aloud, the cadence of entitlement in his mouth. Delivery to a Father Binoti, he says, nothing revolutionary, only a name that has become a ledger entry in this city, both ordinary and dangerous. The officer notes it with a stroke of his quill. The search becomes a tax on attention. Shelves are tilted, drawers pulled and emptied. Dust rises and falls like small sighs. I feel the shop as a body being tended by hands that do not know its secret scars. They pull out a child's primer, Lucy's favorite, from the back of a shelf and leaf through with an absent tenderness. I can see my reflection in the glass of the case, and in that mirrored woman I study the possibility of action. There is always one who moves too quickly. An agent finds a mislaid page, a single folded note I had forgotten to tuck away because I had believed it safe inside the spine of a traveler's atlas. He unfolds it with the greedy concentration of someone reading a list for the first time. The letters there are innocuous names of bread suppliers and dates for delivery, but in the tight economy of the tribunal they take on an accusation. Tending to the movement of goods is tending to circulation itself, and circulation is a small kind of sovereignty. I move then like someone performing a lining stitch, with small, invisible motions. While one agent thumbs through a ledger, I slide my hand beneath a volume and coax out 3 slips of paper. The margin notes pale pencil scrawls and annotations that had been our map slip from binding to binding under the pretense of straightening a page. Each slip is a seed of doubt. Each slip is the map doubt we have taught others to read. To the agents, I am simply putting books in order. You keep odd hours, observes a clerk, perhaps more curious than cruel. He jostles past me and I let him. There is a violence in the casual that is sharper than any blade. His presence presses my scalp like cold wind. Jean Morel stands with his hands folded at his back, as if he were listening to a sermon. He is here to enforce, but his shoulders carry a memory of other wars and other needs. He watches not the books, but the people. When an agent opens a drawer and finds only sewing needles and a spool of thread, Jean's hand moves as if to cover the discovery with another object. It is the smallest of gestures, but it is the kind of soft antagonism that can rewrite a day's harm. He catches my eye for a moment. That look is an intervention. Is there anything you would want us to know? The officer asks, as if by offering a space for confession, he has already rendered the world tidy. My answer is a piece of furniture, truth framed in ordinariness. We keep local histories, I say, plates, notes, marginalia, for the parish mostly. It is a phrase that couches the danger in ecclesiastical terms, and the clerks make the calculation quickly, Father Binoti again. The name hums between us like a lit match. Madame Rousseau steps forward at the window. Her head is like a small planet of gossip, and in it all sorts of collisions take place. She pats a hem and says, loud enough for those near her to hear, I saw a young man leave here at dusk with a sack full of pamphlets. He ran east toward the market. The clerk lifts an eyebrow and writes. Her voice is thin with excitement. She has found herself a part to play. I record her as a hazard and a convenience. Every shop has one of her kind. It is a social instrument I have had to learn to pluck. Outside the street is a skein of faces. Bastien is there, small, quick, a live thing that looks like a hand trying to keep up with a cart. He passes leaflets into fingers with an art that is half bravado and half terror. The leaflets are our counter lists, clean, printed, plausible. Tiny's hand trembles in my memory.